So
which sounds
from
great. So I think without further ado, I'm gonna open the floor to you, Patrick. If you want to start sharing, your
per
title this evening is A Fatal Expedition: The Irish Lieutenancy of Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March and 7th Earl of Ulster, 1423 to 25. So it does very much speak to Simon's point about the brevity of time Mortimer Earls spent in Ireland.
Well,
There we
thank
go.
you very much,
I
Paul.
can see your slides. That's fine.
Perfect. Grant. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Paul. And before I start, I'd also like to thank Philip as well for inviting me to give this lecture and for his work in helping to well, sorry, I say his help for Philip's efforts in actually organizing this. So without further ado, in the early autumn of 1424, Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March and 7th Earl of Ulster, sailed from North Wales from the port of Beaumaris to Ireland. According to the later annals of the Four Master, Edmund arrived around the time of Michaelmas, and on his arrival, the English of Ireland rose up at his summons. While the annals of Ulster record that many of the Saxons, or English, came with him to Ireland, and following his arrival, there went many of the magnates of Ireland to the house of that earl, and came therefrom in great concord and honour. Yet, in a few months, the earl was dead, struck down by plague at Trim Castle in January 1425. Due to the brevity of his time in Ireland, the last Mortimer Earl's Irish expedition and his wider lieutenancy has been brushed over by historians. For historians of the English lordship of Ireland, it is a brief interlude in the escalating crises and struggle between James Butler, 4th Earl of Ormond, and the Talbot family, namely John Talbot, Lord Furnivall, who was to later find fame in the French Wars, and his brother Richard Talbot, Archbishop of Dublin. While for historians of Lancastrian England, Mortimer's departure to Ireland, usually framed as exile from the Lancastrian courts, and his subsequent death removed any immediate dynastic threat to the infant Henry VI, and paved the way for Mortimer's nephew and heir, Richard Duke of York, who Matthew will be talking about later, to mount his own claim to the throne later in the 15th century. Now, today's paper hopes to offer some partial redress to the neglect of Mortimer's lieutenancy and provide a wider discussion of it and contextualize it against Mortimer's own wider career. Now, as part of this contextualization, I will first outline Edmund Mortimer's military career leading up to his lieutenancy of Ireland, as well as his relationship with the Lancastrian court, particularly during the early minority of Henry VI. This is in part to give some sense of Mortimer himself, who's not yet been subject to any detailed study. By 1424, when the Earl did set out for Ireland, he was a seasoned military commander with ample military experience from Henry V's wars in France. Now, as of course is very well known, shortly before setting off for the 1415 campaign, which was to culminate in the Battle of Agincourt, Mortimer was implicated in a plot by his former brother-in-law, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, to overthrow Henry V and his brothers and to place Mortimer on the throne. Mortimer, of course, brought news of this plot to Henry V, which culminated in Cambridge's execution. Nonetheless, the whole sordid events must have placed a cloud of suspicion over Mortimer as he set sail to France. Now, he participated in the difficult siege of Harfleur that August, but nothing is known of any of his actual actions during the siege. But in common with many members of the English army, the Earl, with much of his retinue, contracted dysentery and was shipped home following the successful takeover of Harfleur. Consequently, Mortimer played no role in the Battle of Agincourt, though some members of his retinue are known to have done so. And indeed, he was perhaps in England when the early unfounded rumors of that Henry V had suffered some great disaster in France. And I do wonder what he might have thought of those in the few days before that was quickly turned out to be false. Now, in 1416, the following year, he accompanied the king's younger brother, John, Duke of Bedford, on his naval expedition to the Seine Estuary, where the English achieved a notable naval victory against the French fleets. Now, it's possible that Mortimer displayed some aptitude for naval conflicts, for after Henry V crossed back to France into Normandy in 1417, the Earl was not part of the initial English invasion, but in fact skimmed the English Channel with a small fleet before himself landing in France. Now, after doing so, he seems to have been nearly trapped by quicksands on the Norman coast, but he eventually managed to extract himself for that and taking part in the siege of Cherbourg, spearheaded by the Duke of Gloucester, the king's youngest brother. Henceforth, Mortimer played a regular role in the king's military operations in France, such as at the siege of Rouen the following year, and of course he's also noted as one of the section leaders of the English army at the siege of Meaux in 1421 to 22. Now, out of all the Mortimer Earls, Edmund, we were quite fortunate in possessing several of his actual retinue rolls, which actually allows us in some ways to very kind of accurately detail the military following Edmund was able to bring with him to France. Now, to give it, I think it's kind of useful. I think to kind of give an example of the type of men who are surrounding the Earl, like his military advisors. I've decided to focus on someone who accompanies him to Normandy in 1417, Sir John Pauncefote, who was Lord of Hasfield, which is in Gloucestershire, and Crickhowell in South Wales. Now, Pauncefote was a long-standing servant of the Mortimer family. He had accompanied the fourth Earl of March, the Earl's father, Roger, to Ireland in 1394, and was granted an annuity of £20 from the Welsh lordship of Clifford and Glassbury by the fourth Earl in 1397, wherein he's described as the Earl's bachelor. That is one of his closest sort of knightly followers. Following the Lancastrian usurpation, Pauncefote would accompanied Henry IV on a Scottish expedition in 1400, during the course of which he was Mains, and in light of his wounds, the king granted him in 1401 a £40 annuity from the Lordship of Pembroke. Now, unsurprisingly, I think given his importance in the household of the fourth Earl of March, Pauncefote found a ready patron in the Earl's son, Edmund the fifth Earl. Now, according to his surviving Mortimer household accounts, the Earl was at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire on the 2nd of April 1414. The same day, the Earl's official paid money to a local ferryman as the Earl and his entourage crossed the River Severn and travelled to Pauncefote's Manor, which is likely nearby Hasfields. More information about his patronage from the fifth Earl can be found in a receiver's account for Clifford, Glassbury, and other Marcher lordships from 1420/21, which you can actually just see on the screen behind the text. According to this account, on the 1st of October 1415, which may have in fact been while the Earl was still possibly in Harfleur, if he had not already been shipped home back to England, the Earl granted Pauncefote an annuity of £20 from the lordships of Clifford and Glassbury. Additionally, we know that on the 31st of March 1417, Edmund granted the Pauncefote an additional annuity for life of £13 6 shillings 8 pence, and on the same day granted to his wife a lifetime annuity of £6 13 shilling to 12 pence. Now, as the receiver paid out £40 in annuity payments to Pauncefote and his wife during the 1420-21 financial year, this means that the grant of the 1st of October 1415 was really a confirmation of Pauncefote's earlier annuity granted by Earl Roger Mortimer in 1397, rather than a supplementary grant like that we see in 1417. This later supplementary grants must have been linked to the upcoming expedition led to France by by Henry V that year. Pauncefote and his eldest son William were both members of the Earl's retinue in that campaign, and it may have been with an eye to his possible death that his wife Alice also received an annuity. You can actually see her the second bottom line there, Alice, wife of the said John. Now, now the point of all this quick excursion to John Pauncefote is that not only do we know that Edmund Mortimer himself had ample military experience, in his case in France itself, but we do know that the Earl had many people around him, such as Pauncefote, who, as well as military experience in France, we know had military experience in Ireland, not least in the 1390s. The second aspect of the Earl's career to kind of briefly consider is his relationship with the Lancastrian courts. especially after the death of Henry V. Now, Edmund was among those present when Henry died at Bois Vincennes on the 22nd of August, 1422. Now, of course, as it won't be a surprise to anyone, the Earl held an anomalous position at this time, given his potential status as a dynastic rival. Nonetheless, he was among the members of the Great Council, which set out to govern England during the long minority of the King Henry VI, who was, I think, 6 months when he became king. Now, Mortimer, in these early months, appears to have been an ally of the Cardinal Beaufort, but I think perhaps it's more to the point Mortimer was on the opposing side to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who picked a quarrel with Mortimer in 1423. Humphrey drew attention to Edmund's retinue at the October 1423 Parliament, which he claimed was far larger than any allowed to him by Henry V. While there's no way of proving the truth of Gloucester's claim, it may well have been based on some facts. Against this growing dispute, we also should mention the execution of Sir John Mortimer for treason in February 1424. Though only distantly related to the Earl, the shared surname increased the notoriety of John, who was in fact contemptuous of the Earl. Now, John's life and fate has been really well reconstructed elsewhere by Ian Mortimer which can be found in the Society's volume, The Dynasty of Destiny. And what I think was quite interesting is that while Sir John is, in my opinion, in some ways a political non-entity, the execution of an individual with that dreaded surname, Mortimer, an individual who, moreover, wanted to get rid of the reigning Lancastrian dynasty, must have been in some sense a warning for Mortimer. And at the very least, it did place him, I think, in a very uncomfortable political position in England. While it has been suggested, I think, predominantly by early historians of the Lancastrian court that Edmunds was effectively exiled to Ireland. I think it should also be considered on an alternative view. I think could be that Ireland actually, in some sense, provided Mortimer a sense to kind of remove himself from the English courts, and that ways a safety valve for what could be seen as, an increasingly toxic political atmosphere. And so it's on that will actually now turn to Ireland itself. The English lordship of Ireland during the latter years of the reign of Henry V had become embroiled in strife and conflict between two rival factions. One which was centered around Sir John Talbot, Lord Furnivall, who had led an effective but very unpopular Lieutenancy of Ireland during 1414 to 1420, and James Butler, 4th Earl of Ormond, who replaced him as lieutenant for 1420 to 1422. Now, the animosity between these two men is not our primary focus, but it is important to stress that the conflict between them had been destructive for the English colony in Ireland. Now, in the words of John Swain, Archbishop of Armagh, in a letter from the later 1420s, he describes Ireland as this: all this land is severed as a result of this conflict. Now, this of course posed a peculiar problem for the minority governments of Henry VI at this time, who needed to appoint a candidate who was in some sense both above both factions, but at the same time acceptable to both of them. Now, the obvious candidate for some time must have been Mortimer. Now, in his own right, Edmund Mortimer was, at least on paper, the greatest English landowner on the island, with titles including Earl of Ulster, Lord of the Liberty of Meath, at the very least, the theoretical lordship of Connacht, and he was perhaps more effectively a lord of a third of the Liberty of Kilkenny, and he also held a scattering of manors of Munster, not such as in Tipperary. Additionally, the Mortimer family had long-standing good relationships with both the Butler and Talbot families. 30 years previously, in 1397, both Mortimer and Butler's fathers had signed an indenture which bound the previous Earl of Ormond to serve the Mortimer Earl in peace and war in his wars in Ireland. While John Talbot's grandfather, a man named Sir Richard Talbot, had accompanied Mortimer's grandfather, also named Edmund, to Ireland during 1380 to 81. And perhaps I think we can say perhaps I think we can probably assume that Mortimer and Sir John Talbot had many, at least written interactions during the latter's lieutenancy in Ireland, as Talbot had campaigned on lands bordering Mortimer's Liberty of Meath. While we do know more concretely, Mortimer had granted an annuity to Talbot's. Due to these long-standing familial and personal ties and his own great wealth, Mortimer may well have been viewed as a unifying figure in the Irish colony. However, for a variety of reasons, Henry V had preferred to keep the Earl with him in France, rather than sending him off to Ireland, with the king no doubt fearing that perhaps Mortimer could make mischief, or perhaps instead allow himself to be the pawn of other plotters. However, following the king's death and an infant child on the throne, there may have been some in Lancastrian circles who may have seen the value in sending Mortimer off to Ireland, where both his father and grandfather had perished in the midst of their own lieutenancies. Alternatively, we could also suggest that Mortimer may himself have welcomed a taste of independent command away from the Lancastrian courts. Now, in regards to the claims that Mortimer was effectively exiled to Ireland due to his conflicts with the Duke of Gloucester in late 1423 and then early 1424, I think it is worth mentioning that financial provisions for Mortimer's lieutenancy in Ireland, either in person or by a deputy, were being discussed by the English Royal Council in March and April 1423. So roughly like 8, 9 months after the death of Henry V, there are plans that it is time for Mortimer to go to Ireland. Now, terms were agreed upon, and on the 9th of May, 1423, Mortimer was appointed as the Royal Lieutenant in Ireland for a term of 9 years. And among the powers granted him was the power to appoint a deputy, which in Ireland, which actually Mortimer attempted to do in August 1423. By letters patent that dated at Ludlow Castle on the 4th of August, he appointed Edward Dancy, Bishop of Meath, his deputy. However, on the 24th of September, a month and a half later, at Drogheda, the bishop presented his letter of appointments along with royal letters patent to the Irish Royal Council, which was headed by the previous justiciar and the current Chancellor of Ireland, Richard Talbot, Archbishop of Dublin, and of course, and the younger brother of John Talbot. Now, Richard, interestingly, refused to kind of step aside, and in some ways questioning the legitimacy of the Earl's letters to appoint a deputy to the lieutenancy in Ireland. Nonetheless, despite the Bishop of Meath's initial setback, he does seem to have been able to establish himself as Mortimer's deputy. We know, for example, of a writ which was dated at Dublin on the 4th of October, 1423, so at 2 weeks after that event, which records the appointment of a deputy of the chief engrosser of the Irish Exchequer. The writ was attested or witnessed by Bishop Dancy, who is described in it as the deputy of the Earl of March. Now, it is clear that Dancy's purpose in Ireland in these months was in some sense to prepare the colony for the arrival of the Mortimer Earl. So, for example, we know that on the 5th of February, 1424, while Dancy was in the city of Dublin, a writ was issued to the mayor and bailiffs of the city and to other officials across the colony, which recorded that the Earl was coming to Ireland with a great number of men at arms and archers, with all possible haste for the safety and defence of the lands. As the army would require a very large quantity of grain for its sustenance, it was ordered that it should be proclaimed that on their no one should transport any wheats, oats, or grain to foreign parts under pain of forfeiture. However, at the same time, it seems likely that Dancy was probably experiencing continuing difficulties, where he was later replaced as deputy by Talbot's arch rival, the Earl of Ormond. And Ormond, of course, is described as the Earl's deputy in a writ that dated the 8th of June, 1424. And of course, all this time, Mortimer was in Britain because he was preparing his transport to Ireland. And we know that there were writs issued by the Irish administration in July 1424 to the urban officials of Irish towns and cities to send shipping in Beaumaris in Wales, in the North Wales, for the transportation of Mortimer's army to Ireland. And similar orders can be found in the English royal records in commands to officials in English and Welsh ports. It was at Beaumaris that Edmund issued a charter to the prior of the Hospital of St. John the Baptist of Ludlow on the 22nd of September, 1424. Now, this charter is actually of a special interest because it actually it has a list of witnesses attached to it. And the very first witness on the list is none other than Sir John Talbot. I think what we can draw from this is that with by being able to say that we know that Talbot is in Mortimer's personal retinue as he's preparing to travel to Ireland, and with Talbot's rival, the Earl of Ormond, acting as Mortimer's deputy in Ireland, it is clear that Edmund was in some sense trying to cool tensions between both factions, or in other words, they don't have to like each other as so long as they respected his authority and his commands. Now, Mortimer must have set sail to Ireland soon after, around the time of Michaelmas, or the 29th of September, as recorded in one set of Irish annals. Now, 4 months later, he would be dead. Given the brevity of Edmund's time in Ireland and the relative paucity of records from this period, we will focus on what surviving evidence we have in order to reconstruct the Earl's aims and ambitions in Ireland. Now, it does seem that he was intent on cementing his authority over his vassals on the island. I think one of the more remarkable survivals of the wider Mortimer archives, which dates from this period, is an English letter, the only actually surviving letter the only surviving record recorded in English among the Mortimer archives I've came across, which was written in the Earl's name while he was at Dublin on the 11th of October, and it's addressed to a man named Baldwin Vere, Treasurer of the Liberty of Meath, which you can actually see on the screen. And I think because of its brevity, uniqueness, and shortness, I'll actually quote the letter in full. So the Earl, as the Earl says to Baldwin, "Well, beloveds, we greet you well, and we will and charge you that ye do send out precepts to all our homagers within our liberty of Meath, to come and do here homages unto us at Trim upon Monday or Tuesday next coming, without any fail or excusation made the contrary, written at Dublin the 11th day of October." Now, as this verse says, Edmund was expecting to receive homage from his English vassals, presumably in the Liberty of Meath, which of course would have served as an opportunity for the Earl to better acquaint himself with his vassals personally. It is also, I think, important to note the recipient of the letter, Baldwin Vere. Now, Baldwin Vere was in fact one of the Earl's closer household servants. A surviving account roll in the British Library for the Welsh Marcher Lordship of Maelynid for September 1423 to September 1424 describes Vere as the treasurer of the Earl's household. Now, rather fortunately, we have a surviving writ produced by the Chancery of the Liberty of Meath on the 20th of September 1423, which intersects with the beginning of that financial account, which records that Vere had been appointed as Treasurer of the Liberty, with the Dorsh stating that his appointment had been enrolled in the memoranda rolls of the Exchequer for Michaelmas term. Now, what these two pieces of evidence indicate is that Vere must have initially has served as the treasurer of the Liberty at a distance, having probably appointing a deputy before eventually traveling to Ireland. But his appointment, I think, indicates a desire on Edmund's part to place his Irish lordships under the control of individuals that he personally knows, he personally trusts, and is somebody he can more effectively commands. And we do know that Edmund did actually seems to have kept up his promise in the letter to travel to Trim shortly afterwards, for there is a record to a now lost deed dated the 15th of October at Trim, in which he appointed a man called William Lucy, who was again, like Vere, another close family servant, and Lucy was among the witnesses to the Earl's Charter at Beaumaris in September, which featured Talbot. And Lucy was appointed to be the steward of the Meath Liberty. So in this case, so the two leading figures of the Liberty were now so was, were no were not members of the local tenantry, but in fact men brought over. Now it seems that Trim was the Earl's principal residence during his remaining stay in Ireland, which is unsurprising as it was the caputs of the Liberty of Meath and his most important castle in Ireland. It was at Trim on the 2nd of January 1425 that the Earl granted an annuity of 66 shillings and 8 pence to his herald, who was called March Heralds, for pleasing and laudable service done and to be done in the future. This annuity was to be for life and was to be drawn from the profits of his water mills in Callan in County Kilkenny. That Mortimer did travel to Dublin again could perhaps be suggested by a writ produced by the Irish Chancery dated the 4th of December 1424, which refers to £10 being assigned to the repair of Dublin Castle and its chambers following a discussion between Mortimer and the Irish Royal Council. However, at the same time, this discussion could well have happened at Trim. I think perhaps though the details are in some ways perhaps impossible to know for sure, but I do think it's likely that the fatal illness, the so-called plague, which struck the Earl, must have been fast acting, for it was at Trim on the 18th of January, some 2 weeks after the grant to his herald, that he died of whatever is meant by the description of plague. However, despite only being in Ireland 3-4 months, it's clear that Mortimer had not remained inactive. As was to be expected, as well as his dealings with his English vassals and tenants, Mortimer did have dealings with Irish or Gaelic Irish lords. For example, a surviving indenture made between James Butler, Earl of Ormond, and Donogh O'Brien, whose lordship lay in the Wicklow Mountains, made at Dublin in December 1425, so 11 months after Mortimer's death, explicitly refers to an earlier indenture made by Donogh and the Earl of March and Ulster, which must have been made in late 1424. Based on this latter indenture, it seems the two men, Donogh and Mortimer, had made terms relating to the safe travel and activity of merchants in Donegal's lands, an interesting indication of the economic linkages between English and Irish lordships on the islands, as well as an agreement on both parties to make amends for any injuries made on each other by either Donegal's men on the English colonists or vice versa. Moreover, just prior to his death, and as was recorded in the Irish annals, Edmund had received the submission of many of the Irish lords of Ulster at Trim, who were in fact travelling home through the Liberty when the Earl suddenly died. Following the Earl's untimely death, Talbot, who was clearly in the Earl's company, was appointed as his emergency replacement, and he promptly took those Irish lords prisoner. Now, just like his father and grandfather before him, it does seem that Edmund was keen to assert his authority in Ulster and likely insisted on these Irish lords on the carrying out of the Bonnet of Ulster, a form of billeting imposed on the Irish of Ulster, which had been, of course, more famously one of his father's principal aims in Ulster during the 1390s, and does in fact feature an indenture made after Mortimer's death between Ormond and an Irish lord who agrees that he'll perform the bonnet for Mortimer's heir, Richard, Duke of York. Edmund was appointed lieutenant for 9 years. He served over a year in absence and then around 4 months in person. His achievements, if any, are hard to measure and must have proved immediately ephemeral. What he may have achieved after 9 years is unclear. However, it is clear he had an advantage as a candidate for lieutenant over both Talbot and Ormond. He was, of course, much wealthier than both men, and though his Welsh marcher estates had been ravaged in the early years of the 15th century during the revolt of O Englandure, they still remained clearly very profitable in the 1420s and provided him with both an important source of money and perhaps just as importantly, manpower. Mortimer also had extensive estates in Ireland. He could call upon a networks of individuals whose families had served his ancestors, and with a child king on the English throne, Mortimer could probably have expected to act with a fair degree of independence in Ireland. A slightly similar situation had actually occurred 2 generations previously for his grandfather, the third Earl of March, who also died prematurely in Ireland. In short, the political situation in 1424 to 25 offered a tempting playing ground for any ambitions Mortimer may have had in Ireland, and it had the potential to resurrect the old hegemony of that once possessed by the De Burgh Earls of Ulster. So briefly and shortly and short-lived, which was as briefly achieved by his father and grandfather during their own lieutenancies. It was, however, not to be. Struck down by plague, with Edmund died the Mortimers of Wigmore, and his lands and claims would pass to his nephew, Richard, Duke of York, which would have far-reaching consequences for the respective histories of Ireland, England, and Wales. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Patrick. Great. Brilliant. I mean, you've crammed an awful lot in there to such a short, well, career and also a short period of chief governorship. So thanks for that. Now, according